A gunshot cracked through the darkness. Or maybe it was just thunder in a dream. I bolted upright anyway, my hand already wrapped around the cold steel of the revolver I kept under my pillow. My heart was a wild bird beating against my ribs. The thin cotton of my nightgown was damp with sweat, clinging to my skin despite the desert chill. Silence. A thick, heavy silence pressed in on me. I strained my ears, listening for a footstep, a broken twig, anything. Nothing. Just the wind. That old lonesome wind, whispering through the cracks in my cabin walls. It carried the scent of sage and dust, the smell of my isolation. It was the dream again, the same one that had hunted me for 2 long years. I was running, always running, the rain coming down in sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, masking the sound of my own ragged breaths, masking the sound of his footsteps behind me. My face throbbed, a phantom pain from a real memory, and his voice, thick with whiskey and rage, echoed in my head. "Sarah, you can't run from me." I lowered the gun, but my fingers wouldn't uncurl from the grip. Sleep was a distant country now, one I wouldn't be visiting again tonight. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the rough-hewn floorboards cold against my bare feet. The cabin was just one room, a hearth for warmth, a table for my meager meals, and the narrow bed where I fought my demons every night. Through the single grimy window, the moonlight painted everything in shades of silver and gray, turning the familiar shapes of my life into menacing strangers. I moved to the hearth, my bare feet silent on the wood. I stirred the embers, coaxing a faint orange glow back to life, and added a small piece of juniper. The wood hissed and popped, then caught. Flames danced, throwing shifting shadows on the walls. The heat barely touched the chill that had settled deep in my bones. As the fire grew, I found my hand drifting to my face, my fingers tracing the faint discolored shadow beneath my right eye. It was the last mark Victor had left on me before I ran. The bruise had faded long ago, but some days I could still feel it. A ghost of a pain, a reminder of the man I'd fled, a reminder of the woman I used to be. Dawn was still hours away, but my day had already begun. There was no going back to sleep, not with the ghost of his voice still in my ears. I dressed by the firelight, my movements methodical, automatic, a cotton shirt worn soft from 1,000 washings, a woolen skirt patched at the hem. My boots cracked and scarred but sturdy. They had carried me far. I pulled my reddish-brown hair back, twisting it into a severe knot at the nape of my neck. There was no looking glass in my cabin. I had no desire to see the woman who stared back at me. A woman alone. A woman marked by whispers. The widow who killed her husband. That's what they called me in Copper Springs. They never said it to my face, of course. They didn't have to. I saw it in their eyes. I saw it in the way the women clutched their children closer when I walked past the mercantile. I saw it in the way the men watched me, their faces a cocktail of suspicion and a darker, hungrier curiosity. But they were wrong. Victor wasn't dead. At least I hadn't been the one to kill him. But out here, in a place where a woman's reputation was all she had, fleeing your husband was as good as putting a bullet in his back while he slept. Sometimes I wondered if it would have been easier if I had. By the time the first hint of gray light touched the eastern hills, I had already mended a shirt for a local ranch hand, prepared a new batch of lye soap for washing day, and choked down a breakfast of cornmeal mush that tasted like ash in my mouth. I gathered my goods for the trip into town. A jar of preserved peaches from the small tree I nurtured behind the cabin. 2 freshly mended shirts, a handkerchief embroidered with desert wildflowers, the last of my fine needlework. It wasn't much, but it might be enough for flour and coffee. It had to be. The road to Copper Springs was a dusty scar winding through hills dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. 2 years ago, when Victor first dragged me out here from Missouri, these same hills had seemed wild and full of promise. Now they were just the walls of my prison. Beautiful, yes, but they didn't care if I lived or died. The indifference of this land was a cold comfort. Copper Springs had seen better days. It was a town built on a dream of copper, a dream that had mostly dried up. The richest veins had played out years ago, leaving behind a husk of a town, populated by folks too stubborn, too poor, or too broken to leave. Its future, if it had one, hung on the promise of a railroad spur being built 10 miles south. Men in suits from back east had been seen at the hotel, spreading maps across tables, their voices low as they spoke of progress and opportunity. Their words felt like a foreign language in this place of dust and decay. I kept to the edge of the main street, my boots kicking up little puffs of red dust with every step. I could feel their eyes on me. Mrs. Foster on the mercantile porch, the same woman whose husband once offered to keep me company after Victor vanished. Jenkins, the livery owner, who'd refused to sell me a horse last year, even when I had the coins counted out in my hand. Sheriff Donovan, who had listened to my story of Victor's fists with a look of bored indifference, as if a beaten wife was the most common thing in the world. Maybe it was. "Morning, Mrs. Hargrove." The voice belonged to Thaddeus Clemens, the telegraph operator. He was the only person in this whole town who spoke to me like I was a human being. He was an old man, thin as a rail with spectacles perched on his nose. He'd come west for his lungs 30 years ago and had seen the town boom and bust. "Mr. Clemens," I said, offering a small nod. "Any news?" he asked, his eyes magnified by the thick lenses studying my face. "Railroad men say the spur might reach us by winter if the Apache don't give 'em more trouble. Another group of investors arrived yesterday. Eastern money, you know." He lowered his voice. "You holding up all right out there? All alone?" My back went rigid. The question was kind, but it still felt like a judgment. "I manage," I said, my voice flat. "Never doubted it," he said with a brief, kind smile. He leaned a little closer over his counter. "Though you might want to know, heard tell of some strangers asking about property lines out your way. Surveyors, maybe. Might be nothing. But I thought you should keep an eye out." A cold knot formed in my stomach. Strangers. Property lines. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I turned and walked toward the mercantile, the knot in my gut tightening with every step. Mrs. Foster pretended she didn't see me until I placed my goods on the counter. Her face was a mask of sour disapproval. "Don't need peaches," she sniffed, not even looking at them. "Got plenty canned." "The shirts then," I said, keeping my voice steady. "They're good work." Her lips thinned into a razor line as she inspected my stitching, searching for a flaw she couldn't find. "2 bits," she finally said. "For both." It was highway robbery. The threat alone cost more than that. I wanted to argue, to throw her cheap offer back in her pinched face. But I knew better. A woman like me couldn't afford to make enemies. I already had a town full of them. "And a pound of flour with that," I said instead. The transaction was cold and quick. I stepped back onto the dusty street, my basket lighter, but the small pouch of coins in my pocket barely heavier. The walk back home would be long. As I headed for the water pump at the end of the street, I saw him. A stranger. In a town like Copper Springs, newcomers weren't rare, but this one was different. He was tying a rangy bay horse to the rail outside the saloon. He stood tall, but his shoulders were stooped, like he was carrying a weight no one else could see. His duster was coated in the fine red dust of the territory. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, but it couldn't hide the angry white scar that traced his jawline. It was his eyes that stopped me cold. They were pale blue, almost colorless in the harsh sunlight, and they were empty. It was an emptiness I recognized. The look of a man who had seen too much and slept too little. The look of a man who was haunted. His gaze flicked toward me, and for a single breathless heartbeat, our eyes met. There was no hunger in his look, no pity, no judgment. Just a flicker of something I couldn't name. Recognition, maybe. Then he looked away deliberately, as if the very act of looking was a danger. I went to the pump, suddenly aware of my patched skirt and the dust on my boots. I worked the iron handle, the rhythmic squeak, a familiar sound in the quiet street. Cool water splashed into the basin. As I bent to cup the water in my hands, a shadow fell over me. It was him, the stranger. He stood a careful distance away, his hat now clutched in his hands. His hair was dark, streaked with gray at the temples. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low, rough with disuse. "Mind if I—" He gestured to the pump. Something about his caution, the way he held himself like a man expecting to be told no, struck a chord. But 2 years of fending for myself had built high walls around my heart. Cowboy, I said, my voice sharp, cutting through the silence. Is your mind always between a woman's legs? Is that why you look so lost? The words were a test, a warning. Don't you dare look at me the way they do. I braced myself for his reaction. A smirk, a sneer, a step closer. I was ready to push, to scratch, to run. But the stranger did none of those things. He didn't even blink. He just lowered his eyes, waited for me to step aside, and then worked the pump handle. Water spilled into his battered tin cup. But he didn't drink. Instead, he turned and offered the cup to me. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely at odds with every man I'd met in this town, that I took it without thinking. The water was cold and tasted of iron and earth. It was the best thing I'd tasted all day. Thank you, I said, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. He just nodded once, then refilled the cup for himself, drinking deeply. A gust of wind swept down the street, carrying the first chill of autumn. I shivered, the thin cotton of my shirt no match for the cold. Without a word, the stranger shrugged out of his duster and held it out to me. It smelled of horse, tobacco, and the open trail. It smelled of a life lived far from this dusty little town. My pride screamed at me to refuse, but the cold won out. I took the heavy coat and draped it over my shoulders. It was warm from his body. You have a name? I asked, studying the scar on his jaw. He hesitated, as if the question was a complicated one. Nathaniel, he finally said. Nathaniel Reed. Sarah Hargrove, I replied. I didn't offer my hand, neither did he. We stood there in a strange, silent truce. The sun beat down. A dog barked somewhere down the street. It was just another morning in Copper Springs, but something felt different. You planning on staying, Mr. Reed? I asked, not sure why I wanted to know. He looked past me, toward the hills that held my cabin. Not sure yet, he said, his pale eyes meeting mine for just a second. Just need a quiet place. For a spell. I almost laughed. Quiet? Copper Springs was a snake pit, just a quiet one. He'd learn that soon enough. Well, I said, shrugging off his coat and handing it back. Thank you for the water. Took the duster. You live around here? He asked, his voice neutral. I hesitated. I never told strange men where I lived. But something about this one, something about the weary emptiness in his eyes. I have a cabin, I said finally. North edge of town, past the old cottonwood. He nodded just once. Safe journey home then. It was a dismissal, but a kind one. I turned to leave, feeling a strange pang of disappointment. I was halfway down the street when the sky went dark. I looked up. Black clouds were boiling up in the west, swallowing the blue. A storm, and it was coming fast. I started to walk faster, my basket bumping against my hip. Then I broke into a run, the first fat drops of rain splattering in the dust around me. I reached my porch just as the sky opened up. Rain hammered the roof, a deafening roar. I rushed inside, grabbing buckets to place under the worst of the leaks. Through the storm I heard it. Hoofbeats. Getting closer. My hand went to the revolver in my pocket. I moved to the window, peering through the sheet of rain. A rider hunched against the downpour. As he drew closer, my heart leaped into my throat. It was the bay horse. It was Nathaniel Reed. He dismounted in the mud, led his horse to the flimsy lean-to I used as a stable, and then walked toward my porch. I opened the door before he could knock. The revolver was in my hand, visible. Storm caught me, he said, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. Your place was the closest. I can sleep in the lean-to, if you'll allow it. I looked at him, standing there, soaked to the bone. Having a man on my property would start a whole new firestorm of gossip in town. But turning him away in this deluge felt wrong, cruel. I stepped back, opening the door wider. You can dry off inside, I said, my voice flat. Then we'll see. He hesitated, his eyes moving from my face to the gun in my hand. I don't mean to impose. It's not an imposition if I invite you, I said. Then I added, my voice cold as the rain. But I'll shoot you if you give me a reason. A flicker of something that looked like respect crossed his face. He nodded once, wiped his muddy boots on the porch, and stepped inside. The cabin suddenly felt impossibly small. His presence filled the space, a dark, quiet energy that hummed in the air. He stood awkwardly by the door, dripping onto my floor. "Hang your coat on the peg," I said, turning to build up the fire. The simple, familiar task helped to steady my nerves. It was the first time a man had been in my home since Victor. The thought made my shoulders tense. When I turned back, he was standing in his stocking feet, his boots placed neatly by the door. "Sit," I said, gesturing to one of the two chairs at my small table. "I'll make coffee." He sat perching on the edge of the chair as if he were ready to bolt at any second. His eyes never stopped moving, taking in the room, the single window, the door. He was like a cornered animal, and I knew that feeling all too well. As I measured out the coffee grounds, I could feel him watching my hands. Not in the way other men watch me, but with a detached assessment. He was gauging the threat. "I meant what I said," I told him, my back still turned. "About shooting you. I've done it before." "I believe you," he replied. Something in his tone made me look back at him. He had his hands flat on the table, where I could see them. His pale eyes were calm, steady. "I'm not here to hurt you, Mrs. Hargrove." "Sarah," I corrected him. "Mrs. Hargrove was my mother-in-law, a woman I'd rather not be reminded of." He nodded. "Sarah, then." The coffee began to boil, its rich aroma filling the small cabin. I poured 2 cups, setting one in front of him before taking the other chair. I made sure I could see both him and the door. Old habits die hard. "Why Copper Springs?" I asked, getting straight to the point. "It's not on the way to anywhere." He wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "Heard there might be work. Railroad." It was a good answer, a believable answer. But the way his eyes shifted told me it wasn't the whole truth. "The railroad's months away," I countered, "if it comes at all." "Then I'll move on," he said, taking a sip of coffee. He closed his eyes for a moment. "This is good. Thank you." The simple gratitude disarmed me. "You're welcome." We sat in silence, the rain drumming a steady rhythm on the roof. I studied him more openly now, the way his shoulders hunched inward, the lines around his eyes that made him look older than he probably was, the calloused hands that told a story of hard labor. "You've been on the trail a long time," I observed. He nodded. "Too long." "Running to something?" I asked. "Or away from it?" His eyes met mine, a flicker of surprise in their pale depths. "Both, I suppose," he said after a long moment. "Isn't it always?" He was right. I was running from Victor, from the memory of that night, and I was running toward a peace I wasn't sure I'd ever find. A crash of thunder directly overhead shook the small cabin. A new leak sprang in the corner, water pattering onto the floor. Without a word, Nathaniel got up, took an empty bucket, and placed it under the drip. As he moved, I saw it again. A slight hitch in his step, a stiffness in his left leg, an old wound. He sat back down and nodded toward my door. "Door needs fixing," he said. "Hinges are warped, letting in the cold." "I know," I snapped, a defensive edge in my voice. "I'll get to it." He held up a hand, a gesture of peace. "Didn't mean anything by it, just an observation." "I can take care of myself," I said, the words sharper than I intended. "Never doubted it," he said, his voice calm, unruffled. I felt a flush of shame. He hadn't judged me. He'd simply stated a fact. But I was so used to being on the defensive, I saw attacks where there were none. "I'm sorry," I said stiffly. "That was uncalled for." He just shook his head. "No need. It's your home, your rules." That simple phrase hit me harder than a fist. Your home, your rules. Victor had never seen this place as mine. It was his. Everything was his, including me. "I can look at it tomorrow," Nathaniel offered, nodding at the crooked door. "Before I head out. Won't take long." I wanted to say no. I wanted to insist I didn't need his help. But the door did need fixing, and my own attempts had only made it worse. "If you want," I said, trying to sound casual, "I can feed you breakfast in exchange." His lips twitched into something that was almost a smile. Fair trade. The storm raged on. Night had fallen, dark and absolute under the heavy clouds. It was time for him to go. But the thought of sending him out into that weather, to sleep in a leaky lean-to. You should stay, I said, the words surprising me as much as they did him. Not in here, I added quickly, but the lean-to isn't fit for man nor beast tonight. There's a shed out back. It's dry, mostly. He studied my face, searching for something. Fear, maybe. Reluctance. He must not have found it, because he nodded. Thank you. I'd be obliged. I got up and pulled a spare blanket from the chest at the foot of my bed. It's not much, I said, holding it out to him. It's more than I expected, he replied, taking it carefully, his fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second. A jolt, like lightning, shot up my arm. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. He pulled on his damp boots and coat. At the door, he paused. He didn't look at me when he spoke. I'm a light sleeper, he said. If you need anything, if anyone comes, just call out. He was offering to protect me, a stranger. It should have felt insulting. Instead, a knot of fear I hadn't even realized I was carrying loosened in my chest. Good night, Mr. Reed, I said softly. Nathaniel, he corrected, finally glancing back at me with that ghost of a smile. Mr. Reed was my father, a man I'd rather not be reminded of. The echo of my own words from earlier made me smile, a real smile this time. Good night, Nathaniel. Good night, Sarah. He slipped out into the rain, pulling the door closed behind him. I slid the bolt home, the solid click a reassuring sound in the storm-tossed night. For the first time in 2 years, I wasn't entirely alone. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't dream of running. The next morning, the storm was gone. Sunlight streamed through the window and I found Nathaniel already on my porch, examining the broken door hinge. He fixed it with a quiet competence that was both impressive and unsettling. We ate breakfast in a comfortable silence, and I found myself admitting that it had been a long, long time since I'd felt anything but wary in a man's presence. He was a stranger, yes, but he didn't feel like a threat. When he was ready to leave, his horse saddled, I found myself asking a question I hadn't planned. Will you come back? He paused, his hand on the saddle horn, and looked at me with those pale, unreadable eyes. Would you want me to? The lean-to needs work, I said, a compromise between yes and no. It was the best I could do. A flicker of understanding crossed his face. Fair trade, he said, echoing his words from the night before. He mounted his horse and rode toward town. I watched him go, a strange mix of relief and disappointment swirling inside me. Who was this man? And why did I already hope he'd keep his promise? The day passed in a quiet rhythm of chores. I tried not to think about him, but my eyes kept drifting to the bend in the road. It was late afternoon when I heard hoofbeats again, but it wasn't Nathaniel. The man who rode up to my cabin was dressed in a fine suit, though it was dusty from the trail. He rode an expensive horse and had the soft, well-fed look of a man who did his work in an office, not under the hot Arizona sun. I moved to the porch, my hand resting on the rifle I kept leaning against the wall. Mrs. Sarah Hargrove? He called, his smile practiced and cold. Who's asking? I said. Theodore Blackwood, he said, as if the name should mean something to me. Of the Arizona Territorial Bank, an investment company. A banker. My blood ran cold. What business does a banker have with me? Your property, he said, getting straight to the point. My clients are prepared to offer you a very generous sum for it. The railroad is coming, Mrs. Hargrove. This land will soon be very valuable. It's not for sale, I said flatly. His smile tightened. Perhaps I should be plain. According to our records, this property carries a significant debt, a loan taken out by your husband that remains unpaid. The world tilted. Victor. He was still finding ways to ruin my life, even after all this time. What loan? I demanded, though a sick feeling told me it was possible. Victor had been a ghost, but his debts were all too real. I have the documentation right here, Blackwood said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. A substantial sum, with 2 years of interest? Well, you can imagine. He held it out to me. If you cannot pay the debt, and I think we both know you cannot, the property must be forfeited. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I'll give you a week, he said, his voice smooth as poison. After that, legal proceedings will commence. It would be a shame to see you evicted, Mrs. Hargrove. A woman alone. Well, it's a dangerous world. He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving me standing on my porch, the world crumbling around my feet, a debt I couldn't pay, a home I was about to lose, and a threat, veiled but unmistakable. As darkness fell, I sat by the window, the banker's words echoing in my head. A sound outside made me jump, my hand flying to my revolver. Footsteps. Too light for a horse. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. "It's Nathaniel." Relief washed over me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. I unbolted the door. He was standing on the porch, his tall frame a solid silhouette against the starry sky. "I saw your light," he said. It was a thin excuse, but I didn't care. He saw my face, and his expression hardened. "What happened?" As I told him about Blackwood, about the debt, about the threat, I saw a new kind of tension enter his frame. His pale eyes went cold and hard. "You've heard of him," I said. It wasn't a question. "He has a reputation," Nathaniel said slowly. "He buys land cheap, sells it dear. He's not too particular about his methods." "Do you think the debt is real?" I asked, a sliver of hope in my voice. "I think," he said carefully, "that it would be worth confirming." He paused. "I'm riding into town tomorrow. I could go with you, to see Judge Sullivan." The offer surprised me. "Why?" He looked away toward the dark hills. "Safety in numbers," he said, but it felt like more than that. "What are you really doing in Copper Springs, Nathaniel?" I asked, the question I'd been holding back all day. He was silent for a long moment. When he finally looked at me, the weariness in his eyes seemed to go bone deep. "Looking for peace," so he said. "Same as you, I expect." We stood in silence, the lamplight casting long shadows. It wasn't the whole truth, I knew, but it was a truth I understood. The next morning we rode into town together. The stares we got were hotter than the morning sun. A woman like me, riding with a scarred stranger. It was a scandal, and in Copper Springs, scandal was the only entertainment they had. Judge Sullivan was an old man, with a beard like a snowdrift and eyes that had seen everything. He listened to my story, stroking his white beard. "Blackwood," he rumbled. "Ambitious fellow." He pulled a dusty ledger from a shelf. "Victor Hargrove, you say? 2 years ago." He flipped through the pages. Finally he looked up, his expression grave. "There's no record of any such loan in the Territorial Register, Mrs. Hargrove." Hope surged in my chest. "So it's a lie." "I didn't say that," the judge cautioned. "Only that it wasn't properly registered, which is curious. Blackwood's no fool." He leaned forward, his old eyes sharp. "I would advise caution, Mrs. Hargrove. Sometimes the past is best left buried." The cryptic warning sent a shiver down my spine. What did he mean? What did he know about Victor? Outside, I told Nathaniel what the judge had said. "So we wait," he said, his gaze sweeping the street. "We wait for Blackwood to make his next move." As we were preparing to leave, a commotion erupted outside the saloon. A group of angry miners had surrounded a tall Apache man. Their voices were raised, their hands inching toward their guns. And in the middle of it all, trying to calm the situation, was Theodore Blackwood. "Now, gentlemen," he said, his smile slick and false. "Our visitor was just leaving." He turned to the Apache man, his voice dropping into a menacing purr. The Apache man said nothing, his face a mask of stone. But as he turned to walk away, his eyes met Nathaniel's. A look passed between them, a look of recognition. We mounted our horses, eager to leave the tension of the town behind. We had just cleared the last building when Blackwood rode up behind us. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, his eyes flicking from me to Nathaniel. "I see you found company. How resourceful." He ignored Nathaniel completely. "Have you considered my offer? Time is of the essence." "I spoke with the judge," I said, lifting my chin. "He has no record of any debt." Blackwood's smile never faltered. "An administrative oversight. The debt is quite real, I assure you." "Then bring the papers to the judge," Nathaniel said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge of steel. Blackwood finally turned his attention to him. "And you are?" "Nathaniel Reed." Blackwood's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something I couldn't decipher in their depths. "Well, Mr. Reed," he said, turning back to me, "I'll do just that, but it won't change the outcome. Some debts cannot be escaped, Mrs. Hargrove. One way or another, they must be paid. He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and unanswered questions in his wake. He's lying, I said, once he was out of earshot. I saw it in his eyes. Nathaniel nodded, his gaze still on the retreating banker. Men like that, he said, believe the law is just another tool to get what they want. As we rode home, the sun climbing high in the sky, I finally asked the question that had been burning in my mind. You knew that Apache man. Nathaniel was silent for a long time. I rode with the 4th Cavalry, he said finally, his voice flat. Fought Apaches all over this territory. The admission explained so much, and yet it opened up a dozen new questions. Back at the cabin, the afternoon was quiet and tense. I tried to go about my chores, but my mind was a whirlwind. Blackwood, the debt, the judge's strange warning. It was a puzzle, and I was missing too many pieces. That's when I saw her coming up the path. Mrs. Henderson, my nearest neighbor, an elderly widow who was the only kind soul in this part of the country. She leaned heavily on a walking stick, her face etched with worry. Sarah, dear, she said, her sharp eyes immediately landing on Nathaniel. You have company. Nathaniel Reed, I said, a friend. The word felt surprisingly true. A friend, she repeated, her eyes twinkling. Well, you could use one, especially these days. She lowered her voice. There's talk in town, Sarah. Not just about the railroad. There's talk of silver. I stared at her. Silver? In these hills, she nodded, her expression serious. A rich vein, they say. Old man Willis claimed he found it years ago, before he died. Now these men from the east are buying up all the land around here. Your land, Sarah. They think the silver is on your land. Suddenly everything clicked into place. The fake debt. Blackwood's desperation. It wasn't about a railroad corridor. It was about what was underneath my feet. Be careful, dear, Mrs. Henderson whispered as she left, Nathaniel walking her home. Blackwood isn't a man to be trifled with. And if Victor is involved somehow, her words hung in the air, a chilling possibility I hadn't dared to consider. What if Victor wasn't gone? What if he was part of this? That night, Nathaniel and I ate a quiet supper. The news about the silver changed everything. If the value is in the silver, he said, his voice low and thoughtful, then finding it first gives you leverage. Blackwood can't mine what he doesn't own. But how? I asked. Prospectors have been over these hills for years. Not all of them, he said, his pale eyes gleaming in the lamplight. If I were looking, I'd start in the drainage behind your cabin, where the storm might have washed away the soil, exposed something new. A flicker of hope ignited in my chest. Tomorrow, I said, at first light. As he turned to leave for the shed, I called his name. Nathaniel, thank you. He paused at the door, his weathered face softening. No thanks needed, Sarah. Get some rest. Tomorrow might be a long day. He was right. It was the beginning of a war. We were in the hills by sunrise. Nathaniel moved with a purpose I hadn't seen before. His eyes scanning the rocks, the soil. He knew what he was looking for. Quartz outcroppings, he explained, stained with iron oxide. That's where you find silver. He was a different man out here, away from the prying eyes of the town. He was focused, knowledgeable. He told me he'd worked the Comstock mines in Nevada after leaving the army. He could read the story of the earth and the rocks. By midday, the sun was a hammer, beating down on us. We'd found nothing. I was ready to turn back, but Nathaniel pointed to a rocky ridge ahead. One more look, he said. Good vantage point. From the top, the whole world spread out below us. My little cabin, the distant smudge of Copper Springs, and to the north, the vast, rugged expanse of the Apache reservation. There, Nathaniel said suddenly, pointing. See how the rock changes color? I followed his gaze. A band of lighter stone, almost white, cut across the red-brown rock of the hillside. We scrambled down the treacherous slope, excitement overriding our exhaustion. It was quartz, a wide vein exposed by the recent storm. Nathaniel knelt, chipping at the rock with his small pickaxe. He held up a fragment, turning it in the sunlight. His pale eyes lit up with a fire I'd never seen. See these dark streaks? He said, his voice tight with excitement. He handed me the rock. It was heavier than it looked. That's argentite, silver sulfide. It's here, Sarah. The silver is here. I stared at the rock in my hand, at the dull gray lines that promised a future I'd never dared to dream of. Hope. It was a dangerous, beautiful thing. We need to be careful, he warned as we headed back to the cabin, the sun sinking low. If Blackwood gets wind of this, he'll abandon any pretense of the law. What now? I asked, my mind racing. How do we prove it? We need an assay, he said, a proper test, but we can't trust the office in town. I'll have to take samples to Socorro. It's a few days' ride. You'd go alone? The thought of him leaving, of being alone again, sent a pang of fear through me. Safer that way, he said. You stay here. Protect your claim. As we approached the cabin, I saw a flicker of movement, a rider coming from the direction of town. Get inside, Nathaniel said, his voice low and urgent. From the window, I watched the rider approach. It wasn't Blackwood. It was a young Apache man, riding with an easy grace. He reined in his horse and spoke to Nathaniel in halting English. I bring a message, he said, from Tallwood. He wishes to speak with you. My blood ran cold. Tallwood, the name of the Apache Nathaniel had recognized in town. He says you know him, the young warrior continued. He will meet you tonight, when the moon rises, at the Speaking Rocks. Come alone. His dark eyes flicked toward the cabin, and I knew he could see me watching. The woman is not invited. He wheeled his horse and was gone, melting back into the landscape. Who is Tallwood? I asked, stepping onto the porch as Nathaniel turned, his face a mask of stone. He was a scout, Nathaniel said, his voice distant, for the cavalry, during the war. An Apache scout, working for the army against his own people. The world was a more complicated place than I had ever imagined. It's a trap, I said. Maybe, he agreed, but if Tallwood wanted me dead, he wouldn't need to send an invitation. If he wants to talk, it's important. He looked toward the northern hills, toward the reservation. I have to go. That night, as he prepared to leave, a knot of worry tightened in my chest. Be careful, I whispered. He paused at the door, his hand reaching out as if to touch my face, then dropping back to his side. I'll be back before dawn, he promised. If I'm not, go to the judge. Tell him everything. Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I spent the night pacing the small cabin, the revolver a heavy weight in my pocket. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind was the sound of approaching danger. My mind replayed the night Victor had disappeared, the storm, the shouting, the terror, and the gunshot, the one I had fired, the bullet that had grazed his shoulder and sent him staggering out into the rain, screaming promises of revenge. I had told myself he was dead. It was easier that way. But the judge's warning, Mrs. Henderson's fear, what if I was wrong? Just before dawn, I heard hoofbeats. I rushed to the door, my heart in my throat. It was Nathaniel. He looked exhausted, his face grim in the pale light. What happened? I asked, pouring him a cup of coffee. He took a long swallow, the warmth of the cup doing little to thaw the chill in his eyes. Tallwood confirmed it, he said, his voice rough. The silver is real, a major deposit. It runs from your land north into the reservation. The Apache had known about it for generations. They considered it sacred, but a secret like that can't stay buried forever. Blackwood knows, I guessed. Nathaniel shook his head. Blackwood is just the money. The man pulling the strings is someone who knows this territory, someone with local connections. He met my eyes, and I saw the terrible truth in them. Tallwood has seen him, a man meeting with Blackwood's surveyors on reservation land, a man with a scarred shoulder. The coffee cup trembled in my hand. It couldn't be, after all this time. Victor, I whispered. The name tasted like poison. He was alive. My monster was alive, and he was coming back for me. He was coming back for everything. What do we do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The fear I had lived with for 2 years was back, a cold, coiling serpent in my gut. He won't get near you, Nathaniel said, his voice a low growl, harder than anything I'd ever heard from him. I promise you that. But there was more. Tallwood had offered an alliance. His people had as much to lose as I did if Blackwood started mining. They would watch Blackwood's men, warn us of any movement. They would offer protection. Why? I asked. Why would he help us? Nathaniel's face was haunted. Because he spared my life once during the war, he said, his voice thick with a pain that was decades old. And I repaid him by continuing to fight against his people. I owe him a debt. The weight of it all settled on me. A silver mine, a corrupt banker, a vengeful, abusive husband I thought was dead, and a strange, haunted man with a debt to an Apache chief. This was my life now. The next morning we rode back to the ridge. The air was thick with unspoken tension. We were being watched, I could feel it. Victor knew these hills. He knew my routines. He would be waiting. We worked quickly, gathering more samples of the silver ore. Nathaniel told me about the war, about the arrow that had crippled his leg, about how Tallwood had saved him. His story was one of regret, of a good man forced to do terrible things. And in that moment, I understood him. We were both survivors, haunted by the ghosts of our past. We were packing up the samples when we heard them. Riders coming up the slope. "Move!" Nathaniel hissed, pulling me behind a cluster of boulders. It was Blackwood, and he had 2 hired guns with him. They had found our horses. "Find them!" we heard Blackwood snap, his voice echoing up the ridge. "They can't have gone far. Just get rid of her and be done with it." My blood ran cold. This wasn't about the law anymore. It was about murder. We scrambled up the ridge, looking for another way down. We heard Blackwood's men shout that they'd found the spot where we'd been digging. The hunt was on. We found a game trail and started down the treacherous slope, rocks skittering under our feet. We reached the bottom, a dry wash that snaked through the hills, and started running. If we could make it back to the cabin, we could barricade ourselves in, make a stand. That's when the rifle shot cracked through the air. A bullet slammed into the bank of the wash, just inches from my head. "Down!" Nathaniel yelled, tackling me to the ground as a second shot whizzed past. We were pinned. The shots were coming from a rise to the east. The shooter had the high ground. We were trapped. "It's him," I choked out, the dust and fear thick in my throat. "It's Victor." Nathaniel's face was grim. "He knows these washes. He knew where we'd go." He pulled a small tin of tobacco from his pocket. "I'm going to create a distraction, a smoke signal. I'll draw his fire. You run." "No," I cried. "I won't leave you." "This isn't a debate, Sarah," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "He wants you. I'm just an obstacle. If we separate, he'll follow me." He pressed the heavy canvas pouch of silver samples into my hands. "Take these. If anything happens to me, get them to the judge. Make him understand." He promised he'd be careful. He promised he'd circle back. But as he lit a small bundle of grass and tobacco, and the thin plume of smoke began to rise, I saw the look in his eyes. It was the look of a man who didn't expect to survive. He gave me a nod. "Now go." He broke from cover, running up the wash. A rifle cracked, then another. Victor was shooting at him, and I ran. I ran in the opposite direction, my lungs burning, the pouch of rocks bouncing against my chest. I didn't look back. I just ran, tears streaming down my face, the sound of gunshots echoing behind me. I reached a stand of mesquite and collapsed, gasping for air. I couldn't see Nathaniel. I couldn't see Victor. The gunshots had stopped. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. I made my way back to the cabin, moving from cover to cover, my heart a stone in my chest. He was gone. Nathaniel was gone. I had to get the samples to the judge. I had to make sure his sacrifice wasn't for nothing. The cabin was empty, undisturbed. I hid the pouch of samples under a loose floorboard, my hands shaking. What now? Wait? Run? A soft knock came at the door. I froze, my hand on my revolver. The knock came again. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. A signal. "Sarah," a voice whispered. "It's me." I threw the door open. It was Nathaniel. He was dusty and scratched, but he was alive. Relief washed over me, so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. "It was close," he said, moving to the window. "Victor's a good shot. I saw him just for a second." "The samples are safe," I told him. "But what now? They're hunting us." "We have to get to Socorro," he said. But they'll be watching the roads. There's only one other way. His eyes met mine. Through the reservation. Tallwood offered help. It's time we accepted. We waited for darkness, the tension in the small cabin, thick enough to cut with a knife. He told me why he was helping me. He said that when he saw me standing up for myself at the town pump, he'd been reminded that there were still things in this world worth fighting for. As night fell, we gathered our meager supplies, a canteen of water, the last of our food, and the precious silver samples. As we prepared to slip out the back door, we saw it, torches moving through the darkness, coming from town. Blackwood's men, Nathaniel murmured. They're coming to search the cabin. We had to move, now. We slipped into the night, keeping to the shadows. Behind us, we heard shouts as the riders reached the empty cabin. Then a bright flare of orange lit up the sky. They had set my home on fire. I watched as the flames consumed the small cabin, the only home I had known for 2 years. I felt a strange sense of detachment. That life was over. The woman who had lived in that cabin was gone, burned away with the wood and the memories. We can't stay, Nathaniel said gently, pulling me into the darkness of the wash. We traveled all night, moving north under the stars. The land grew wilder, more rugged. We were leaving the world of men and laws behind, entering a place that was older, more dangerous. Just after the moon rose, we crossed the invisible line onto the Apache reservation. We were on their land now. We found a small overhang in the bank of a dry arroyo to rest. I'll keep watch, Nathaniel said, his revolver resting on his knee. I was so exhausted I fell asleep almost instantly, the hard ground a welcome bed. I woke to the light of dawn. Nathaniel was building a small signal fire. A thin plume of smoke drifted up into the clear morning air. Will they welcome us? I asked, the reality of what we were doing sinking in. Tallwood will honor his word, he said. The others, we'll see. An hour later we saw them. 3 riders coming from the east. It was Tallwood and 2 of his warriors. Tallwood was an old man, but he sat on his horse with the straight-backed pride of a king. His face was a roadmap of a hard life, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. You bring trouble to my land, Reed, he called out, his voice strong. Not by choice, Nathaniel replied. We seek sanctuary. Tallwood dismounted, his dark eyes studying me with an unnerving intensity. This is the woman, he stated, the one whose land holds the silver. Your husband rides with the men who hunt you. You know this. I know, I said, meeting his gaze. He is not my husband. Not anymore. Something flickered in the old chief's eyes. Approval. Good, he said. A woman should choose her own path. He gestured to his warriors. You will come with us, to the hidden valley. There we will talk of silver and of the men who walk with dishonor. One of the young warriors, a man named Standing Elk, helped me onto his horse. As we rode deeper into the reservation, I looked back one last time. The world I had known was gone, reduced to ash and memory. Ahead of me lay a hidden valley, an alliance with a people I had been taught to fear, and a fight for my life against a man I had once promised to love, honor, and obey. I was terrified, but for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't alone. And for the first time in my life, I felt something new, something fragile and wild, blooming in my chest. I felt free. The journey to the hidden valley was like stepping into another world. The landscape grew more dramatic, a maze of red rock canyons and towering mesas. Tallwood led us through secret paths that no white man could ever find. The air was cleaner here, the silence deeper. It was a land that had not yet been broken by the greed of men like Blackwood. The Apache village was nestled in a small, fertile valley, hidden from the world by sheer canyon walls. It was not the primitive camp I had imagined. There were small, well-tended fields of corn and squash, a clear stream running through the center, and sturdy wickiups, domed huts made of branches and hides. Our arrival caused a stir. Women stopped their work to stare at us, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts. The men, the warriors, were openly hostile. Their dark eyes followed our every move, their hands never far from the knives at their belts. I was an intruder here, a symbol of the people who had taken their land and destroyed their way of life. Tallwood led us to a large wickiup at the center of the village. Inside, a fire burned, filling the space with the scent of cedar smoke. He bid us sit, and an old woman brought us water and a stew made of venison and wild herbs. It was the best meal I'd had in years. We told Tallwood everything. About the silver, about Blackwood's forged debt, about Victor. He listened patiently, his face unreadable. When we were done, he was silent for a long time. "The silver is a curse," he said finally, his voice heavy. "It brings the white man's sickness, greed." He looked at Nathaniel. "You say you want to establish this woman's claim by your law, but your law has never been just to our people." "This time, it can be," Nathaniel argued. "If Sarah controls the mining rights, she can ensure it's done responsibly. She can share the profits with your people. The silver runs under your land, too. This is a chance for your people to have a future, to have something to bargain with." Tallwood considered this. "And what of the man, Hargrove? Her husband?" "He has to be stopped," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "He and Blackwood. They won't stop until they have it all." "This is true," Tallwood agreed. "They are men with hungry ghosts inside them." He nodded, a decision made. "You will stay here. You will be safe. My warriors will watch the borders. When the time is right, Standing Elk and two others will guide you to Socorro. But know this, Sarah Hargrove. If you betray our trust, there is no place on this earth you can hide from us." The threat was real, but so was the promise of protection. We were allies. For now. The days that followed were a strange dream. I lived among the Apache, learning their ways. The women, at first distant, slowly began to accept me. They taught me which plants were medicine and which were food. They taught me how to grind corn on a stone matat, how to bead leather with intricate patterns. They were a proud, strong people, and I saw in them a resilience that mirrored my own. Nathaniel spent his time with the warriors, practicing with a bow, learning the secret trails of the canyon. I would watch him sometimes, and I saw a peace settle over him that hadn't been there before. The ghosts of his past were still with him, but here, among the people he had once fought, he seemed to find a measure of redemption. But our peace was fragile. One evening, a scout returned with news. Blackwood had brought in more men, hard men, with rifles and cold eyes. They were camped just south of the reservation border, waiting, and Victor was with them. The scout said he was drinking heavily, telling everyone who would listen how he was going to get his land back, and his wife. The time had come. We had to go to Socorro. Tallwood gave us fresh horses and provisions. He also gave me a beautifully crafted buckskin shirt and trousers. "You are a warrior now, Sarah Hargrove," he said. "Dress like one." Standing Elk, the young warrior who had first brought me to the village, was to be our guide. He was still wary of me, his pride wounded by having to help a white woman, but he was loyal to Tallwood, and his knowledge of the wilderness was our best hope of survival. We left under the cover of darkness, three of us riding into the vast unknown territory that lay between the hidden valley and the town of Socorro. The journey would be long and dangerous. Victor and Blackwood's men would be hunting us. But as we rode out of the canyon, the cool night air on my face, I wasn't afraid. I was a different woman now. I was no longer running from my past. I was riding to reclaim my future. The journey to Socorro was a blur of sun-scorched days and cold, starry nights. We rode hard, pushing our horses, always looking over our shoulders. Standing Elk was a masterful guide, leading us through a labyrinth of canyons and arroyos, a route that would never appear on any white man's map. He rarely spoke, but his watchful presence was a constant reminder of the danger that stalked us. On the third day we saw them, a dust cloud in the distance. Riders. "Victor's men," Nathaniel said, his voice grim. Standing Elk led us into a narrow slot canyon, the rock walls rising hundreds of feet on either side. We hid our horses and climbed up to a high ledge, watching as the riders passed. There were 5 of them, and Victor was at their head. Even from a distance, I could see the drunken slump of his shoulders, the careless way he held the reins. He hadn't changed. The close call frayed our nerves. That night, sitting by a small, smokeless fire, the tension between me and Standing Elk finally broke. "Why do you help her?" he asked Nathaniel, his voice laced with contempt. He looked at me as if I was something unclean. Her people are the ones who put us on this reservation, who starve our children. She is not her people, Nathaniel said quietly. She is a woman who has been wronged, just as your people have been wronged. The enemy is not the color of a person's skin. The enemy is greed. A man like Blackwood, a man like her husband, they would destroy your people and mine for a handful of silver. Standing Elk was silent, but I could see him wrestling with Nathaniel's words. I knew I had to speak. I can't change what my people have done, I said, my voice quiet but clear. But I can promise you this. If I win this fight, your people will have a share in what is found. The silver is on your sacred land as much as it is on mine. We can be partners. He looked at me, his dark eyes searching my face. I met his gaze without flinching. I held out my hand. After a long moment, he took it. It was a truce, an understanding. We were in this together. We reached Socorro 2 days later, a dusty, bustling town that felt like a different universe after the silence of the reservation. We found the Territorial Assay Office, a small brick building on the main street. I handed the nervous clerk our canvas pouch of samples. He told us it would take a day to get the results. It was the longest day of my life. We took a room at a small hotel, and for the first time, Nathaniel and I were truly alone, without the watchful eyes of the Apache. The small room felt charged with all the things we hadn't said, all the feelings we hadn't dared to acknowledge. That night, we sat by the window, looking out at the lights of the town. "What will you do?" I asked him. "After this is over?" He was silent for a long time, his gaze on the distant mountains. "I don't know," he said finally. "I've been running for so long, I'm not sure I know how to stop." "Maybe you don't have to run anymore," I said softly. I reached out and took his hand. His fingers were calloused and warm. They closed around mine, a gentle, reassuring pressure. We sat like that for a long time, the silence speaking volumes. In that small, quiet room, a new future began to feel possible, a future with him. The next afternoon, we got the results. I held the official document in my trembling hands. The assayer, a man with ink-stained fingers and a perpetually bored expression, had written his conclusion at the bottom of the page. High-grade silver-bearing ore, significant commercial potential. We had it. We had the proof. We were about to leave when Nathaniel stopped. "There's one more thing," he said. He led me to the Territorial Records office. He spent an hour poring over dusty ledgers. I didn't know what he was looking for. Then he found it. He showed me the entry. A loan recorded 2 years ago. A substantial sum taken out by a prominent citizen of Copper Springs. The lender was Theodore Blackwood's investment company. The borrower was Judge Marcus Sullivan. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. The judge, the one man I thought I could trust, his cryptic warning, "Sometimes the past is best left buried." It wasn't a warning. It was a threat. He was part of it. Blackwood was blackmailing him. Now we understood. We couldn't fight this with the law. The law was corrupt. We had to fight it our own way. We rode back to Copper Springs not as victims, but as hunters. We sent Standing Elk ahead to the Hidden Valley with a message for Tallwood. We told him what we had learned, and we told him our plan. We arrived in Copper Springs at high noon. The town was quiet, sleepy in the midday heat, but it wouldn't be quiet for long. I walked directly into the mercantile. Mrs. Foster was behind the counter, her face a mask of sour surprise. "What are you doing back here?" she sniffed. "I've come to settle my husband's accounts," I said, my voice ringing with a confidence I didn't know I possessed. I threw the assayer's report on the counter. "As you can see, I've had a change in fortune." Her eyes widened as she read the report. The news would be all over town in an hour. That was the first part of the plan. Nathaniel, meanwhile, went to the telegraph office. He sent 2 messages, one to the territorial governor in Prescott, detailing a massive silver strike and a conspiracy involving a prominent judge. The second was to a journalist he knew at the Arizona Citizen. The trap was set. Now all we had to do was wait for the rats to come out of their holes. They didn't make us wait long. That evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, they came for us. Victor and Blackwood, with half a dozen of their hired guns. They cornered us in the livery stable. the place where Jenkins had once refused to sell me a horse. "It's over, Sarah," Victor slurred, a whiskey bottle clutched in his hand. His face was bloated, his eyes shot with red. He looked pathetic, not fearsome. "The silver is mine. You are mine." "Nothing here is yours, Victor," I said, my voice steady. Nathaniel stood beside me, his revolver in his hand. "It's over." "Is it?" Blackwood sneered, stepping forward. "I have a legal claim to this land, and a dozen witnesses who will swear you are an unstable, murderous woman. Who will they believe?" "They'll believe this," I said. From the shadows of the stable, a figure emerged, Tallwood, and behind him, 24 Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, bows drawn. Blackwood's face went white. Victor dropped his whiskey bottle, the glass shattering on the stable floor. "You are trespassing on sacred land," Tallwood said, his voice a low rumble, "and you have allied yourself with a man who has dishonored his wife. There is no law for men like you." That's when the townspeople started to gather, drawn by the commotion. They saw the Apache warriors, they saw Blackwood and his gunmen, and they saw me, standing not as a victim, but as a woman who had brought an army to her back. "He's a thief!" I shouted, pointing at Blackwood. "He tried to steal my land with a forged debt. He's been blackmailing Judge Sullivan for years." A murmur went through the crowd. Judge Sullivan, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd, tried to slip away. But Nathaniel was faster. He leveled his gun at the judge. "Stay right where you are, Your Honor," he said, his voice cold as ice. The hired guns looked at Blackwood, then at the Apache arrows aimed at their chests, and they threw down their weapons. It was over, all except for Victor. In a drunken rage, he lunged at me, his face a twisted mask of hate. "If I can't have you, no one will," he screamed. I didn't flinch. I didn't even raise my gun. I just stood my ground. And as he came at me, Nathaniel stepped in front of me. But he didn't shoot. He just hit Victor once. A clean, hard punch to the jaw. My husband, the man who had terrorized me for years, crumpled to the ground in a pathetic heap. The next day, the territorial marshals arrived, summoned by the governor. Blackwood and Judge Sullivan were arrested. Victor was thrown in the town drunk tank, his reign of terror over. The story of the Silver Strike and the conspiracy to steal it was printed in papers all across the territory. I was no longer the widow who killed her husband. I was the Silver Queen of Copper Springs. I kept my promise. I drew up a contract, a partnership between me and Tallwood's people. We would mine the silver together, sharing the profits, respecting the land. It was a new kind of future for all of us. And Nathaniel? He stopped running. He stayed. The ghosts of his past were finally quiet. We built a new house on the ashes of the old cabin. A bigger house. A house filled not with fear, but with laughter and with love. Sometimes when the wind whispers through the canyons, I remember the woman I used to be, the scared, broken woman who flinched at shadows, and I smile. Because the gunshot that woke me up that night, the one that started it all, it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. It was the sound of my life, finally, truly beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments what you would have done if you were in Sarah's shoes.